In this lecture, we are going to begin creating a new user. Just like everything else, WordPress will supply functions for helping us create users. We do not need to manually insert a user into the database. These functions will perform additional validation on our data. They're safer than a manual solution. To get started, open the signup.php file. At the bottom of the function, let's return a function called wp-insert-user. The wp-insert-user function will add a new user to our site. It accepts an array of data that can be inserted into the database. In the resource section of this lecture, I provide a link to this function. On the documentation page, scroll to the parameters section. WordPress will document the various values you can insert into the database. We're not required to add every property. At a minimum, we should provide a username, email, and password. Let's head back to the editor. Inside this array, we are going to add a key called user login. The user login key accepts the username. Let's set this key to the username variable. Next, add a key called userPass. The value for this key will be the variable. Add a key called userEmail. After calling this function, a user should have been created. We could call it a day and leave our function as is. However, it's very common for sites to log a user in after registering an account. It provides a great user experience. We should begin logging the user in. Forcing a login will require the ID of the user. Head back to the documentation page. On this page, scroll to Return section. According to the documentation, there are two possible return values. If the user was created, their ID is returned. Otherwise, an error object is returned. Typically, PHP will stop running a script if an error occurs. However, WordPress likes to wrap errors in an object for our convenience. This behavior allows us to handle errors without crashing our script. Before logging the user in, let's check the return value for an error. Head back to the editor. We are going to assign the return value of the wp-insert-user function to a variable called user-ID. After the wp-insert-user function, create a conditional statement. The condition will be a function called isWpError with the user ID variable. This function will check a value for a valid WordPress error. If there is an error, this function will return true. We should return the response from within the block. If there isn't an error, we can proceed to log in. After the conditional statement, let's run a function called wp-new-user-notification. This function will send an email notification for a new user registration. It's typical for a site to send an email after a user has signed in. Best of all, this function is pluggable. If you have a plugin for handling emails, the email can be formatted with the plugin. Otherwise, WordPress will handle sending the email. This function has three arguments. The first argument is the user ID of the new user. Let's pass in the user ID variable. The second argument is deprecated. The function ignores the second argument. It's recommended to pass in null. The last argument is where to send the email. Should we send it to the admin, user, or both? We can send an email to the user by passing in user. In some cases, you may want the email. You can set this argument to admin. Lastly, you can set the value to both for sending emails to the admin and user. For this case, sending the email to the user will suffice. Next, let's run a function called wp-setCurrentUser with the user ID variable. This function will sign in a user to WordPress. They'll immediately become active with their respective permissions. Unfortunately, their authentication will not persist. Afterward, we can run a function called wp-set-auth-cookie with the user ID variable. This function will add a cookie to the user's browser. A cookie will allow users to automatically log in after closing the browser. Creating a cookie is important for persistence. Browsers will automatically send cookies to the server, which WordPress will use for logging a user back into their account. Both functions are required for logging a user in. The first function will immediately log the user in, whereas the second function will allow a user to revisit our site while staying logged in. We're almost finished. There's one final step. We should notify WordPress and third-party plugins that a user has logged in. There may be other developers who would like to perform additional actions after a user has logged in. It's not required, but recommended. Throughout this course, we've been listening to events with the add action function. We can trigger an event with a function called doAction. Let's call this function before returning the response. This function has one required argument. It's the name of the event or hook. The proper hook for notifying other plugins of a user login is called wp-login. If another plugin is waiting for a user to log in, they will be able to detect a login with this hook. However, we must provide additional data. External hook functions are not provided with the user who is logged in. We must provide this data with the hook. In the resource section of this lecture, I provide a link to this hook. Hooks are documented by WordPress. According to the documentation, this hook is called after a user logs in by WordPress. However, we are manually firing this hook because we've created a custom solution for logging in. The doAction function has an unlimited set of arguments. Arguments after the first argument will be passed onto functions listening to this hook. By default, WordPress will send functions to the user's username and the user object. We should mimic this behavior. Otherwise, plugins will become confused. This could potentially throw an error. Let's head back to the editor. Above the doAction function, define a variable called user. At the moment, we don't have the user object. We only have the user's ID. A user object contains an entire list of properties related to the user. We can grab a user's object by running a function called getUserBy. The getUserBy function will return a user object. It has two arguments. The first argument is how to select a user. We can grab a user by their ID, email, username, or slug. In our case, we have their ID. Let's pass in ID. The second argument is the value. Let's pass in the user ID variable. After grabbing the user object, we can update the doAction function by passing in the following values: user, user login, user. The second argument must be the username of the user. This information is stored in the user login property. The third argument must be the entire user object. Perfect! We've successfully finished the function. We've even taken the time to allow plugins to extend our registration. Let's try testing our endpoint with the Postman application. I'm going to initiate the request one more time. The user I've created should not exist within the system. Our endpoint should be able to create the first user without a problem. After a few moments, the status property has been set to 2. Unfortunately, we can't test the login feature. The request was initiated with Postman, not a browser. If we were to view the front end, we would not be logged in as our new user. We will test this feature in another lecture. For now, let's verify the user was created by navigating to the user's page in the admin dashboard. As you can see, the test user has been created. You may have a different user if you have different registration details. The registration endpoint is complete. The final step is to update the registration form to handle the possible responses from our endpoint. we don't need to use Postman anymore. Before ending this lecture, I'm going to delete this user. Your account should be created via the form, not Postman. You should do the same. In the next lecture, let's begin working on the form for registering a user.